Billionaire minutes from signing $500 million contract. Child exposes shocking trap. He thought he was about to close the biggest deal of his life. $500 million. Months of negotiations, sleepless nights, and endless boardroom battles were about to pay off. The champagne was chilling, the signatures were prepared, and all that was left was a single stroke of a pen. The room buzzed with excitement, investors leaning forward, lawyers shuffling papers, and the towering figure of his soon-to-be partner watching with the calm confidence of a man who always gets his way. But what no one in that gleaming conference hall knew was that beneath the polished smiles, beneath the glittering suits and expensive watches, a trap had been set. A trap so intricate, so carefully disguised, that it could have destroyed not just fortunes, but lives. And the strangest part? The one person who saw it, the one person who dared to stop it, wasn't a lawyer, or a board member, or a billionaire. It was the quiet, unnoticed daughter of a maid. She wasn't supposed to be there. A child in the shadows, invisible to the men who thought they ran the world. Her small eyes caught details no one else did. Tiny cracks in the facade, whispers behind closed doors, papers that didn't match. Where others saw only power and wealth, she saw something far darker. The deal was moments away. The pen lifted, ready to sign. But then, the girl stepped forward, trembling, defiant, and carrying a truth that would shatter everything. What could a child possibly say that would bring a $500 million empire crashing down? And why was she the only one brave enough to reveal what everyone else had missed? This is not just the story of a contract. It's the story of greed, power, and the courage it takes to speak up, even when your voice shakes. A story where the smallest figure in the room exposed the biggest lie of them all. And what happened after no one saw coming? It began like any other day for Jonathan Hale, the kind of man whose name alone could tilt the balance of a boardroom. To the world, he was a self-made billionaire, a symbol of ambition rewarded. His empire stretched across continents, oil, shipping, tech, industries so vast that even governments whispered his name with respect. Yet, for all his power, Jonathan was a man who carried himself with quiet discipline, crisp suits, precise words, and a gaze that seemed to measure everything and everyone. On that morning, he woke before dawn, as he always did. The city below was still draped in shadows, its skyline glittering faintly against the pale blush of sunrise. From the balcony of his penthouse, he looked out at it all. Towers of glass and steel, roads alive with ambition, a world he believed he had conquered. But today was different. Today wasn't about maintaining his empire. Today was about expanding it, sealing a deal so monumental it would etch his name into history. $500 million. The number itself seemed to vibrate in the air, whispered on the lips of every executive and advisor who crossed his path. It wasn't just money. It was legacy. A partnership that promised to reshape industries, unite continents, and give Jonathan power even his rivals couldn't ignore. The stakes were astronomical, the kind of stakes where trust was fragile and betrayal lurked in shadows. The location chosen for the signing wasn't a sterile boardroom, but a private villa on the edge of the city, a place drenched in opulence. Chandeliers glittered above polished marble floors, while gold-rimmed glasses waited on trays of silver. It was a setting meant to impress, to intimidate, to remind every guest that they were entering the domain of extraordinary wealth. Behind the scenes, staff worked tirelessly, servants carrying trays, guards scanning every corner, lawyers preparing documents with surgical precision. Among them moved the invisible hands that made such grandeur possible, the maids, quiet and unnoticed, weaving through the corridors like ghosts. One of them, Maria, had served the household for years. To Jonathan, she was simply the help, loyal, discreet, never out of place. She had brought her daughter that day, a thin, quiet girl who clung to the edges of rooms, her eyes wide with curiosity. No one paid her attention. Why would they? Jonathan arrived at the villa like a king entering his throne room. His associates straightened their ties, bodyguards whispered into earpieces, and the rival party, men in tailored suits with voices soft but heavy with power, extended their hands in polished courtesy. Their smiles were warm, their gestures generous, but their eyes carried something colder, a calculation that didn't match the words spilling from their mouths. The meeting stretched on, hours of negotiations whittled down into final agreements, paperwork stacked neatly, contracts prepared. All that remained was a signature. The champagne was uncorked. Cameras were readied for the symbolic handshake. Yet somewhere in the background, unnoticed by all, Maria's daughter watched with a sharpness far beyond her years. She lingered at the edges of the room, her small frame half hidden behind marble pillars, her gaze flicking between the papers, the men, and the hushed conversations carried just beyond earshot. To anyone else, she was a child lost in luxury, overwhelmed by a world far too grand for her place. But to her, something about the performance felt wrong. The way certain words were avoided, the way one set of documents didn't quite match the other. For Jonathan, none of this mattered yet. He felt the weight of history pressing down on his pen, ready to strike. He thought the day would end in triumph, his empire expanded, his enemies silenced. But what he couldn't know was that the smallest, quietest voice in the room was about to change everything. The villa pulsed with anticipation. Outside, the sun had risen high, pouring golden light across the marble floors and shimmering through crystal chandeliers. Every detail of the room seemed designed to dazzle. The polished wood of the long conference table, the gleaming contracts stacked neatly in leather folders, the cameras positioned for a press release that would announce the deal to the world. Everything screamed victory. Jonathan Hale sat at the head of the table, poised, his pen resting between his fingers. Around him, his advisors leaned forward, whispering last-minute confirmations. Across from him, the representatives of the foreign syndicate, men cloaked in confidence and expensive silk, wore the expressions of hunters circling prey. Their words were honeyed, their smiles practiced. Yet there was something in their stillness, something rehearsed, that gave the air a metallic taste. Jonathan didn't notice, not yet. His mind was fixed on the promise of power. At the edges of the room, Maria's daughter lingered, as silent as the shadows. To the powerful men in the room, she didn't exist. Just another child tagging along where she didn't belong. But her eyes moved constantly, soaking in details no one else cared to see. She watched the lawyers shuffle papers, the quick exchanges between the syndicate's men, the fleeting gestures that betrayed hidden layers beneath the polished performance. Then she saw it. A small detail, almost invisible. 2 sets of contracts. One placed neatly on the table for Jonathan's signature, the other, slightly different, tucked away in a briefcase one of the men guarded closely. She didn't know business law, didn't understand clauses and percentages, but even a child could see the discrepancy. The papers were not the same. Her heartbeat quickened. She remembered overhearing whispers earlier that morning, servants talking nervously about men arriving late at night, carrying suitcases and locking doors behind them. She had brushed it off, thinking it was just the paranoia of adults. But now, standing in the room where history was about to be written, she felt those fragments click together like pieces of a dangerous puzzle. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, scanning the documents, satisfied with the promises they seemed to hold. But the girl's gaze stayed fixed on the briefcase. Her small hands fidgeted at her sides, the weight of what she saw pressing heavily on her young shoulders. She didn't fully grasp what was at stake, but she understood this much. Something was wrong. As the clock ticked closer to the ceremonial signing, the atmosphere grew heavier. The syndicate's men leaned closer, their voices silk over steel, urging Jonathan to sign without hesitation. One of them reached across, tapping the page with a manicured finger, guiding his pen like a puppeteer. Jonathan's advisors, eager for victory, nodded, their eyes gleaming with visions of profit. But Maria's daughter couldn't ignore the unease rising inside her. She noticed another detail, a slip of paper left carelessly in a folder. It bore the emblem of the syndicate, but listed terms far harsher than those Jonathan had been promised. Ownership percentages, hidden clauses, rights surrendered. It was a trap disguised as opportunity. A $500 million snare. The girl's small chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to rush forward, but fear clamped her throat shut. She was just a child. Who would listen to her? What if she was wrong? Yet with every second that passed, the pen in Jonathan's hand drew closer to sealing his fate. The cameras were ready. The champagne flutes glistened. The world outside waited for headlines that would celebrate Jonathan Hale's greatest triumph. But in the silent corners of the room, a child trembled with the burden of a truth too heavy for her years. And in that moment, as Jonathan poised his pen over the line, she made her choice. The pen hovered above the page. Cameras clicked softly, anticipating the stroke of ink that would finalize history. Jonathan Hale's signature, bold, commanding, would secure the deal, elevate his empire, and cement his name across financial headlines. But just before the tip touched paper, a small, trembling voice broke the silence. "Wait!" Every head turned. For the first time, the men at the table noticed her. Maria's daughter, standing in the corner, her wide eyes locked on the stack of contracts. The air shifted, heavy with disbelief. What business did a child have interrupting billion-dollar negotiations? Jonathan froze, his brows furrowing. The syndicate's men exchanged quick, irritated glances, their masks of charm momentarily slipping. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The girl swallowed hard, her voice quivering but clear. "That paper, it's not the same. They have another one. It's different." She pointed at the briefcase, her fingers steady despite her trembling body. For a moment, silence clung to the walls. Then laughter, sharp, dismissive, cutting through the tension. One of the syndicate's men leaned back, smirking. "A child's imagination," he said smoothly, waving it off as though swatting a fly. Perhaps she should wait outside while the adults talk. But Jonathan didn't laugh. Something in the girl's tone, the urgency, the conviction, pierced through the haze of pride clouding his judgment. Slowly he lowered his pen, his eyes narrowed as they shifted to the briefcase. "Open it," he said. The smirk faltered. The room stiffened. For the first time, the syndicate's polished confidence cracked. "Mr. Hale, surely you don't—" "Open it," Jonathan repeated, his voice now sharp, commanding. All eyes fixed on the man clutching the case. His knuckles whitened as he hesitated. Then reluctantly, under Jonathan's glare, he set it on the table and snapped it open. Papers spilled out, and in an instant, the truth gleamed under the chandelier's light. Clauses twisted in foreign legal jargon, ownership stripped, profits funneled, entire divisions swallowed whole. A $500 million empire reduced to a pawn in a far larger game. The trap was undeniable. Gasps rippled through the room. Jonathan's advisors lunged forward, scanning the pages with horror. Cameras clicked wildly, capturing not triumph but betrayal, unraveling in real time. The golden deal had transformed into a poisoned dagger. The syndicate's men tried to recover, their words tumbling into excuses. "It's a misunderstanding." Draft copies. Irrelevant details. But their polished masks had shattered. Their eyes darted, their voices lost the steady rhythm of practiced charm. The more they spoke, the clearer their desperation became. Jonathan's face hardened, the realization crashing down on him. He had been minutes away from signing away everything he had built, all because of greed blinding him to the subtle signs. And yet it wasn't his team of lawyers, nor his board of directors, who had saved him. It was a child, the maid's daughter, unnoticed and underestimated. Jonathan rose slowly from his chair, his height towering over the table. His voice cold and deliberate. cut through the chaos. You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought I was desperate enough to sign my name and hand you my life's work. He lifted the poisoned contract, letting the pages fall dramatically onto the table. But you forgot one thing. Truth always has a way of finding the light. The room erupted. Advisors shouted, journalists scribbled, cameras flashed brighter. The syndicate's men tried to retreat, but security closed in. Their empire of deceit crumbled before the world's eyes. Through it all, Maria's daughter stood frozen, her small frame dwarfed by the storm she had unleashed. Jonathan turned, his gaze softening as it fell on her. For the first time, gratitude replaced pride in his expression. Without her courage, he would have been ruined. The deal was over, not in triumph, but in revelation. And nothing in Jonathan Hale's world would ever be the same again. The room was chaos. Guards escorting the syndicate's men out, journalists barking questions, flashes illuminating the tension like lightning strikes. Yet, in the middle of it all, Jonathan Hale remained still. His hand rested on the contract that had almost ended his empire. The realization was sobering, humbling. For years, he had considered himself untouchable, the kind of man who made billion-dollar decisions over a cup of coffee, who believed his instincts could never betray him. But in those final moments before disaster, it wasn't his instincts, his lawyers, or his power that saved him. It was a child nobody noticed. Maria's daughter stood near the doorway, clutching the hem of her dress, unsure if she had just done something extraordinary or something foolish. Her heart pounded in her chest, her eyes darting nervously from the powerful faces staring back at her. She expected anger. She expected to be told she had overstepped. After all, wasn't she just the maid's daughter? But Jonathan walked toward her, and the crowd seemed to part. His tall figure loomed above her, yet his eyes were no longer hard. They were softer, filled with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Humility. "You saved me," he said quietly, though everyone could hear it. The little girl froze, her lips trembling, unsure how to respond. But Jonathan wasn't expecting an answer. Instead, he turned to the room, his voice louder now, carrying the weight of his revelation. "Remember this moment," he declared, addressing his advisors, the cameras, and even himself. "The empire you all praise me for building. Today it almost ended because I was blind to the truth. And that truth didn't come from a boardroom or a contract. It came from the eyes of a child who dared to speak when no one else would. The journalists caught every word. Headlines would soon plaster the world. 500 Babalaula's trap exposed by maid's daughter. Child saves billionaire from syndicate scheme." But beyond the drama of headlines, a quieter story was unfolding. Jonathan didn't sign the contract. Instead, he called for an immediate investigation. The trap was deeper than anyone realized. A network designed to swallow Western companies into hidden ownership, masking intentions under polished deals. It was exploitation dressed in fine suits, and Jonathan had almost become its trophy. That night, the syndicate's empire began to unravel. But the story didn't end in that boardroom. Days later, Jonathan sat in his vast glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline. The weight of the near loss lingered in his chest. He thought about his own arrogance, about how close he had come to destroying not only his wealth, but the lives of thousands who depended on his company. And he thought about the little girl, Maria's daughter. She hadn't just saved his business, she had saved him from himself. Her courage reminded him of a truth he had long ignored. Real wisdom and integrity weren't bound by status, wealth, or titles. They could come from anywhere, from anyone. So he made a decision. Jonathan invited Maria and her daughter to his office. The child entered nervously, clutching her mother's hand, overwhelmed by the towering skyscrapers and polished floors. But Jonathan greeted her not with the cold detachment of a CEO, but with warmth. "You saw what none of us did," he told her. "You had the courage to speak when everyone else stayed silent. That kind of bravery deserves more than a thank you." He offered her a scholarship, not just for private schooling, but through university, a full commitment to her future. Maria wept, her hands trembling as she tried to thank him, but Jonathan simply shook his head. "No," he said gently. "Don't thank me. Thank her. She is the reason my empire still stands." The girl smiled timidly, her eyes glistening. For the first time, she realized that her voice mattered. Not just in that room, but in the world. The story spread beyond business pages. Social media lit up with the headline. People weren't talking about Jonathan Hale's empire. They were talking about the maid's daughter, a child who, against every odd, had stood up in a room where her presence alone was invisible to most. Commentators called it a lesson in arrogance, a reminder of systemic injustice. How many voices like hers, one journalist asked, are ignored every day simply because of who they belong to? Communities rallied around the story. For some, it was about racial injustice, how a black maid's daughter saw what a room full of powerful white executives missed. For others, it was about class, how society silences those it deems insignificant, only to discover their importance too late. Jonathan, too, reflected deeply. For years, his world had been built on walls of wealth, exclusivity, and hierarchy. But those walls nearly cost him everything. Now he began to open doors instead. He launched a foundation, not in his name, but in hers, dedicated to empowering children from marginalized communities with education, voice, and visibility. If a child's courage can change the fate of an empire, he told the press, imagine what millions of children can do if we simply listen. Months passed, but the story lived on. Jonathan rebuilt his empire with new purpose, his boardroom never forgetting the day it was shaken by a child's voice. Maria's daughter thrived, her future no longer bound by the quiet invisibility society had placed upon her. But the incident left the world with a question, one that lingered far beyond news cycles and boardroom whispers. How many truths are lost every day because we refuse to hear them from the mouths of those we deem too small to matter? The $500 million deal was minutes from being signed. A signature that would have destroyed a man's empire, silenced his workers, and handed victory to deceit. But a child stopped it. Not with power, not with wealth, not with connections, just with truth. And truth once spoken can never again be ignored.